welcome back everyone for the Process Mining Café on Process Mining in Audit. And I'm joined here by Andreas and Jasmine, who just gave the presentation on their audit project at the Wiener Stadtwerke. And in addition, we're joined by Mieke Jans, who's an associate professor at Hasselt University in the Business Informatics Research Group and has worked with process mining in audit for many, many years already, back in 2012 and before, when she was before as a PhD student and then at Deloitte. So welcome also, Mieke. Thanks for joining us. So let's get started with the first question to the group. So one challenge that we see with process mining in audit is that because you're looking at all of the data, you get many exceptions and many more exceptions than you would get if you would look at samples of data. So how do you deal with this?
I think that's a very interesting question, because those exceptions are really, really challenging, because as an auditor, whenever I see an expectation or something that looks strange, of course, I want to know why. Why does this happen? Is there a real problem in the process, for example? And whenever we take a sample, of course, the amount of exceptions will be far lower, so we might have time to look at everything really in detail. But here, if we analyze thousands of cases and we can get hundreds or even thousands of acceptations, of course, we need to find a way to really decide what is a problem here and what can we tolerate. So, for example, of course, whenever we see something that gives us a hint that maybe something with the internal control system, some technical controls don't work, of course, this is really essential that we look at. But for example, if it's just a handling error because some user clicks a button twice, for example, and nothing really happens at the end that makes the process not compliant, then we can simply tolerate this. But it's really, really challenging. And I think what we did is that we tried to group the exceptions we found and then take samples out of these groups in order to get an overview if there is, for example, some general explanation why something happens, or if this really is a problem.
May I immediately ask something? Jasmine, you say that you will group these, what I call deviations. It's a general terminology, of course. In which groups do you then group these exceptions?
I don't think I can give you a general answer for this, because, of course, I always think now on the previous project and the previous experience. Here, we try to group them due to certain attributes, for example. For example, I make something up now, when we find, for example, a group of or some orders that were not released, we try to find out if there is a connection between, for example, are those orders that are all from the same supplier. So maybe there is a rule that for those supplier we don't need an order release or something like that. So it was more an intuitional approach here, and I'm not sure if I could give you a general explanation here, because this is really a point where we still need to learn a lot to make it better. What we do at the moment is that we try to be as transparent as we can. So also in our audit report, of course, we really, really write very detailed where did we look at, what did we find, and to what result we came, and also try to be transparent where we were not able to go in more detail and maybe find a solution for all the deviations we found.
Yeah, I ask because this was actually something that we looked into with a research project. So we bumped into the same problems. There are too many exceptions, and well, in order to classify them as are these really exceptions that we should worry about, which we call anomalies, or are these actually perfectly fine, acceptable exceptions? So in order to start, because you have tens of thousands of these deviations, we also had the idea, well, let's group them. But then we had a lot of internal discussions. This was with a previous PhD student of mine, with Mernush. We had a lot of discussions so we looked at the same deviation and we didn't agree on, well, are these two activities that have been swapped, or is this like one activity that is just executed too late in the process? And so we had a lot of discussions on how to even call this deviation. So from a theoretical point of view, you can very objectively say, well, this deviates from the process model, but then how to call this deviation and how I looked at it was different from how she looked at it. And so this was actually the start for a research project where we said, actually, it's not important how we look at these deviations. We should ask how auditors look at these deviations. And we wanted to investigate whether there was certain terminology that they used, or whether they have fixed classes in their head when they are looking at process deviations. So what we did was we looked first in the literature, which type of deviations do exist. There were some papers that had a theoretical approach for that, like you can deviate in such a way or such a way. And from a control flow point of view, so the sequence of orders, it boiled down to more or less 6 different ways of deviating from a process model. Like you could reorder, you could repeat, you had also self loops, something else than a repetition. You had swap and skipping. And so we started from that, and we did an investigation with auditors who we presented some deviating cases, some exceptions actually, and we asked them like, okay, so this is from a theoretical point of view is an exception. Is this an exception for you, and how does this deviate from the process model in your opinion? And it turned out that auditors, at least the ones that we interviewed, had a smaller set of deviation types than was present in the literature. Actually, it boiled down that they had 3 main categories of process deviations, and one which was not very clear. So it was they either categorize an exception as, well, here they are reordering activities, so no separation whether it was pushed forward or pushed backward. It was just reordered, very general. Either it was like, well, something is missing, or something is repeated. And sometimes they combined it with an insert of an activity, but this was very, there was not a straight line in whenever they used this word of an insert. So that's why I asked, like, how did you approach in practice then to group these exceptions?
Mieke, I have a question. Is there also an approach to get this grouping of the deviations in the approach of use the risk management approach to get how is defined which risk to which deviation group, I call it, and how is the impact of this to get an overview and I think a weighted factor of how is this useful to get that impression? How is defined? How useful is the finding of this category? I called it. Yes.
Yes. Oh, thank you for this. I'm glad to hear that you asked the same questions that we were wondering ourselves. So that's good to hear. Because, of course, starting with these discussions, like how to group these deviations, we had something completely else or a much further plan in mind, and we were pushed back by first having to investigate, okay, which groups do exist. And the next step was indeed like, okay, how can we use now this information? Do auditors make a distinction in terms of risk? Do they associate different levels of risks with these different groups of deviations? And this is actually that was another research executed with another PhD student of mine that we investigated with a discrete choice experiment, whether auditors assigned different levels of risks to those different deviation types. And the preliminary results were that the main distinction was actually within the missing deviation. So whether something was reordered or repeated or inserted, that didn't impact a lot the risk assessment. But when something is missing, this triggered more alarms, or it was perceived as more risky. That was the correct. Correct.
And did you also include in our grouping aspects? I thought that that's the point of view from the auditors. Did you also include the point of the audited party? Because we had in the last meetings the discussion, how important is the finding in relation to it's only one finding of, for example, 10,000 cases? How important is this finding, and in which group is this finding? So it's a point of view of the auditors, and also it's a point of view of the audited party. And so to manage this finding and get how much cost to reduce the risk and control these findings.
No, we did not include the point of view actually of the audited party. That's an interesting suggestion. Thank you. We did not think of that.
Okay.
Maybe that's also something that you mentioned sometime before, Andreas, that I found very interesting. You mentioned that in a way you have to define materiality in a new way, right? When you look at your findings with process mining. And I think that also has to do with these exceptions. It's not that every exception, also like you've shown in your presentation earlier today, not every exception is a problem. And that's also what I hear from what Mieke is saying, is that there are these different types and categories, and okay. So also there, maybe the reordered, missing, and repeated are the ones that the auditors recognize the most. But even in there, missing is much more important. So you have these levels of importance. So can you maybe for the people who are not familiar with the concept of materiality, explain what it is in a traditional audit world, and then how you see that it might be changed through process mining?
I think Andreas.
Sorry, yes, I meant.
Yeah, I think the task or the importance of materiality is one of the main tasks we have in our institutions and Court of Audit. So it's also part of I think the standardization in our area, and it's, I think, the key aspect, but it's not so often and easy, especially for new approaches with process mining, to get to I think we call it the border of this material. Who is the border of this material? I call it so. I think it's also a success factor is to get the right answer of this theme.
Yeah. So maybe what would be a traditional materiality border be? It's usually amount of money, right? So if you're above a certain amount of money, for example, for a purchase order, then that's material. And if it's below a certain threshold, it's less important. Would you say that's true, or?
Jasmine?
Yes, I would say in a very simplified way, we can totally say it like that. There is a certain amount of money, and whenever, for example, the damage of a missing of a control would exceed this amount of money, we say, okay, that's a problem, and that's materiality. And if it's below it, we could say that we don't, I really say it now very simply, we can tolerate this, that's no problem. So, for example, I guess in controlling, you always have it that you don't start searching for 50 missing cents because it's not worth the work to find why they are missing. But up from a certain amount of money, of course, you have to think what went wrong and what is the reason for this. So, of course, we always try to measure it financially, but especially as process mining, I guess it's pretty hard because of when you look, for example, at the missing of an activity. Of course, it's also hard to quantify what damage might result from this.
I think process mining is also in aspect of the financial analysis is, for example, lead times to get in relation how results that in a financial resource, like how much does it cost to take 5 minutes for the procedure or to take 15 minutes for the procedure. So that's the opportunity, the possibility to for process mining to get information about this, and to get this information about the situation. How long does it take the whole procedure? And
Yeah, and what we experienced a lot in our previous audits was not whenever we can measure financial damage, there is no discussion. Then we really quickly agree with the audited party. But for example, when we can't really quantify it and we start discussing that one case out of 10,000 was wrong, then often the audited party doesn't, they just want to know why we care so much for this single problem. And like the example I took before, when that's a problem, for example, in the workflow settings, that shows us that order releases can be performed by everyone, and the technical controls that should be implemented are not working. Of course, we could say, yeah, that's really a problem. There's no discussion about the materiality. But whenever it's something more soft, then of course, not such hard facts like that, then of course there's also for us the problem, how do we deal with it, where do we set the line, what can we tolerate, and where do we really have to also make a recommendation in our audit report.
Mm-hmm. I remember actually a bit of, well, not really the opposite, but it was coming from the other angle. So I was asked by an auditor, so from the audit department, to run a process mining analysis, exactly because they knew that there was a problem with the approval process within the purchase department. So they knew from their previous audits, we have in this company is a problem with segregation of duties, but we can't put a number on it. So that was actually the complete trigger, that single question, to run a process mining analysis, only to put a number on the problem. So there it was really the opposite, that we were asked effectively for putting a number on it. So there we indeed saw there was quite a big problem actually with purchases not being approved, or being approved by by two persons where this was expected above certain threshold. And it was, I don't recall the exact number anymore. Anyway, it was more than 2 million euros of purchases that were not approved through the normal or the expected approval flow. So here it was really the opposite, that it was asked to do a process mining analysis just to know, like, are we talking about a problem that is above the materiality threshold or not? So before they suspected it, but then after the analysis they had a real number, and that obviously helped.
Yeah. Yes. Maybe one other topic I'm also curious about, Andreas, you mentioned before you were, when you mentioned standards. So you're working according to certain audit standards, right? So how do you see those existing standards fit with process mining? Is there some need for change, or does this already apply?
I think it's definitely needs that there is a change. Now the standards which are available do not really cover the really new methods like process mining. So there are more generally formulated that we need a data analysis tool or a concept about this, but not really covers this. I call it new methods like process mining. They are more about the traditional ways, like the sample approach, and get the statistic KPIs to get the right process about to take the samples and analyze them. But the really standards don't really cover the new methods, and think there's a lot to do, and there are some task forces to get insights about how we can deal with this new techniques to get to use it in audit work.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I certainly see a very practical problem. In the audit standards, you have like the test of controls and the test of details. So in the standards, they make a distinction between those two types of tests, where, well, this stems from an era where not everything was digitally stored. So in that era, it made sense to say, well, you have these tests that actually look at the design of control measures and critically assess them, whether these control measures would be sufficient if they would work. And you can do some walkthrough tests and stress tests to check whether they're also effective. But how then do you deal with, well, we're going to test whether controls work by taking all the data and checking whether all the data that have passed these controls actually have the characteristics that you would expect from cases that have been have gone through these controls. So if you have gates installed that only cases of a certain type should be allowed to proceed, then if you take all the cases that have been and that have crossed these controls, you would expect only these type of cases. So this is actually that's the approach that process mining takes. It looks at the cases that have been going through those controls and checks like, okay, does it make sense that we only have these type of cases? And they went through the gates. To put it, I'm always very visual. So they went through the gates. Does it make sense that they went through the gates? And so there are two important questions here. One, is this then a test of detail or is this a test of control? I think it doesn't matter. You just have to do this and then make your conclusions. But from the standard point of view, there's this distinction. So this sometimes gives discussions. Let me put it like that. In working group with auditors, I sometimes have these discussions that they say, well, this is not clear. And the main problem is if it's not clear, the auditor is less, not really in feeling comfortable to bring in process mining if they cannot really pinpoint it in the correct standard. The other dangerous aspect that the auditor should be aware of is that the absence of evidence does not mean that everything worked perfectly. So it does not mean if your gate should only allow cases of type A and you only find cases of type A, that your gate worked perfectly. It could just be the case that no cases of type B tried to go through the gate, but maybe the gate was standing wide open and all cases could just go through them. So that's important to really have this clear view on what is process mining or these after the fact checks of your full population testing. How is this working and how do you have to fit it in with what you're trying to do? So I think these are little things that the standards could, in my opinion, clear quite easily, adapt a little bit, taking away these discussions of causes of fuzziness, like which type of control are we now doing, and also what we touched upon before, how to deal with the exceptions. If you are expected to investigate all these exceptions and you have tens of thousands of exceptions, then this is not possible. And so actually this is something else that we are currently investigating. How can we use artificial intelligence in combination with the human in the loop, the auditor, with the audit expert, with the domain knowledge? Can we use those two elements, those two components, the expert knowledge and the artificial intelligence, to go through all these exceptions? And actually, it's a basic classification problem where you have to classify all the exceptions into, well, this is tolerable. This is just something that was not in the procedural model, but is perfectly fine. And this is an anomaly that should be tested. But then you bump again into, well, you're using artificial intelligence. How do the standards stand against using artificial intelligence? Can you use a black box? Obviously not. You should understand what your algorithm is doing. So there are a lot of research challenges also. So certainly not just like put it in a box of the standards, they just have to adapt and everything is solved. It's not the case. But I think it would be a good point if both could merge a little bit together to each other.
Yeah, that's those are sorry, really briefly. Those are really interesting discussions. Maybe one thing I'm curious about what you said before with the discussions that are happening in the standards. What are these discussions about? Because it's clear that Preslmayr can only test the working and or let's say the reality, and not, for example, whether a control is in place. Right? You can only observe, like you said. So what is the discussion then about? Can you explain?
Well, to be clear, I'm not involved in discussions with the standard setting bodies. So the discussions I was referring to is if, for example, I'm part of a working group on data analytics for the Belgian auditors, external auditors. And when we are simply, for example, writing a brochure of how to use data analytics in auditing, well, even then we are having a lot of discussions just on writing a brochure on how to use analytics, because there we already bump into the problems of terminology and how we can put it forward in a brochure, because it should be in line with the standards. And well, it was not always that easy to put our ideas on how the profession could move forward and how to then also make sure that it fit into the terminology, for example, of the standards. That was what I was referring to.
Yeah.
I think also it's a very interesting question in this part, because the question is how deal auditors with audit intelligence routines, I think. Yeah. So can we audit these routines? And so, for example, in Vienna, there's a light tower project about the building regulations. So that they want to use some artificial intelligence to audit these routines in the process. So I think the special situation for us auditors is how we can deal to get an audit about this artificial algorithm. And I think that's already a very, very challenging question for the future. I think it's the next level of question how we deal with this issue. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Very good. I'm just checking also a little bit in the community. I see mostly also more specific questions about your presentation, Andreas and Jasmine. I think you can go back offline after the cafe to answer those in more detail. But one question from Rudy, I would like to pick up, because I think that's also interesting for this discussion round, and for all three of you actually, because so Andreas and Jasmine did this project based on SAP data, and Mieke, I remember many years ago, you also basically went into the SAP system and tried to get data out of it. And so the question is maybe it's quite clear that it's a challenge if you don't know much about the system, how to do this and how to get the data right for process mining. And what would you advise others when they want to do it, and what do you think should they expect how much time it will take?
Mm-hmm.
From my point of view, I think if you answer me quickly, reserve enough time to get to find the data and get the right data and transform it. I think it's the most challenging part and need the most of the time to do this delivery.
Mm-hmm. In terms of time, I remember, but that was quite some years ago, to put it nicely. I was trying to fetch the relevant data from an SAP system without any knowledge of SAP upfront. So I really started from scratch. I needed to investigate and get acquainted with SAP from scratch. Plus, I was as a PhD student in a bank, so you also have to include time that I needed and the throughput time to, to ask the right people and find the right people and to have the authority of the right people and to have the right sponsors who pushed other people that they should provide access to this PhD student. So you have to include all these elements, of course. And then it took me more or less around 9 months to have the right data and to have it prepped into the format of an event log. So I could say, well, now that was with all these difficulties, and I would be inclined in saying, well, now it would not take that much time anymore. But actually, the hurdles that I had to overcome, I think there are certainly still people who would have to overcome these same hurdles, that they first have to investigate that system that they are not acquainted before, and they have to convince colleagues then that this is worth something. And the most heard objection I heard from the person who actually had to give me the data, she said all the time, well, we have an SAP system. Your whole analysis that you want to do doesn't make any sense. We have an SAP system. Everything is configured. So you do not need that data. And then she just sent me away again. So, well, if there's one benefit of being a bit older, I don't think that she would send me away now as quickly as when I was like 25. But so it took a lot of time, and I still think it will take a lot of time if you do it now.
Yeah, and you showed that you had 17 versions, right? And Andreas and Jasmine, in the transformation. Any other tips you can think of for people who will go through the same, maybe 17 iterations, what they should do?
Yeah, what was helpful for us, we didn't have the problem like Mieke just explained, that our counterpart from the organization just sent us away. Because we had very competent people there who really also understood the data. So whenever you have the chance to get in contact with a data expert, it's really another way of talking compared to when you talk to the process expert, because the process expert uses the system and doesn't really often think about what happens in the background. So here we really had someone we could also discuss our problems with, and this really helped us a lot. One thing I would do differently now is that when we started our analysis and finding the relationship in the data, we could not work with the field names of SAP because they simply didn't mean anything to us. So we gave them our own names and just to understand what it is. But this was really a problem at the end. But when we were into the data, we ourselves only talked in table and field names because we knew them, and we couldn't work with our made-up names back then. Yeah. So
long live Echo and ECBO.
It's maybe a recommendation to just get used to the names, because you will get them into flesh and blood sooner or later anyways.
Yeah, so you need both, right? You need the mapping to where in the process they belong on a conceptual level. So that's the first step. But then, like you've seen, each of these steps, there's multiple fields and multiple attributes related to that. So you have to,
Yep. Actually, on the topic of building the event log, so really starting this conversation, I have the same experiences that you have to. Ideally, you have the project sponsor at the table. You have who is familiar with the process, but also someone who is familiar with the information system and can translate. Like, okay, you're talking about this process step. I know in this table, in this field, there is a timestamp that actually captures that process step. I have written down my experiences on that in a procedure actually, so I can I put it available online. It's just my experiences. It's no academic research. It's not published as a scientific paper or whatever. It's just based on the experiences that I had over the years and how I actually teach my students on how to build an event log. And well, the problem of building 17 different event logs, I haven't gone through that nightmare, I have to admit. But this is actually another problem that is open standing for research, how to deal with the fact that if you want to answer certain questions, you need a different event log than if you would like to answer different questions. So if you would like viewpoint of an order, you can answer these and these questions. But if you take a viewpoint of an invoice, you can answer these and these questions. And this is something that that we're still struggling with. And there is research now looking into solutions and object-centric process mining. It is very nice and an interesting research stream to, put an answer for those shortcomings, actually.
Yes, yeah, these are very good pointers. We will make sure to put them in the Slack also. Indeed, the research on object-centric process mining, that was also the closing keynote by Will van Aalst at last year's process mining camp, was about that. So we can link to that presentation and discussion for people who want to watch that back. But also the practical guide, indeed, Mieke, that you have written up. It's one that I frequently point people to if they have to extract data from SAP. I always tell them, well, you need to actually think about which questions you want to answer, and you will need to make choices based on that. And so
you create 17 logs.
No. That's I think that's the refinement of that, because Andreas and Jasmine, you also had these two different perspectives, right? You had the purchase order and the invoice perspective, and for different types of questions, you needed these two separate data sets. So, being aware of which perspectives you need is something that you have to just make these choices in a conscious way, so we can point to this guide and those resources for people to think about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's of course we could talk hours about the whole topic of data and how challenging the data is, but maybe let's end on a little bit more in a kind of more of perspective way. I remember when I was starting to look at different application areas for process mining during the PhD, and when we were starting out with Fluxicon, I was looking at different fields, and auditors already quite early on seemed like a group who could really benefit from process mining, and I was looking into kind of resources and white papers in this area. And back then already people were always talking about continuous auditing, and that kind of continuous auditing is this big goal and this big dream that will be available very shortly. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? Is process mining bringing us a little bit closer to that, or is that even something that people discuss anymore today?
Well, I think the term continuous auditing is like this. It's like always something in the future that we can strive for. Yeah. The term was coined in 1991. So that's 30 years ago already. And the idea of continuous auditing is, literally, as you can hear it, like continuously auditing all the time. And how to achieve this is by using data analysis. That was like in a nutshell what continuous auditing aimed for, because computer power was increasing. More and more data they already saw this coming. More and more data will be stored in a digital way, so we could run data analysis, and in the end we can have like a continuous auditing where the auditor just takes a smartphone, although there were no smartphones at that moment, but that was the idea. Like the auditor can just check one of the other information system and have a look at the up-to-date state of an organization and whether it is in control or not. That was the idea, and I think this is like this rolling forward idea that will get new characteristics as we move forward. So my idea is that process mining brings continuous auditing a step closer, but we're not there yet.
Great. What do you think, Jasmine and Andreas?
Yes, I would agree on this. So it brings us closer, but we are not there yet. And for example, I think we also have to distinguish what kind of auditor you are. Because for example, we are an external governmental audit institution. So basically, we hardly have any direct access to any database all the time. We only get them really just for the audit we make, and that's always ex post. So this thought of doing a continuous audit all the time, this doesn't fit that good in our way of auditing. But if I think, for example, on internal auditors who often just have the access to the systems anyway, they will be there sooner, I hope so, because even if you don't take the approach of continuous auditing, process mining really also helps you with your follow-up and just to make sure that the recommendations you made were simply put to life, and you can simply very, very easy check if anything in the data changed already, looking back maybe a month or two later after an adaptation was made. So this, I hope this brings us to the goal quicker.
I also agree with Jasmine and Mieke. I think it's not a really topic for our institutions, our level of Court of Audit, because it's only the ex post approach of audits. I think this new technique brings us closer to in the audit procedure to get faster the answer of the audit aspects we do to audit this aspect and get the answer. So the time consuming would be shorter, I think, but it's not really an important factor for discussion to get in our level of Court of Audits to get in continuous auditing.
Yes. Now, in any case, what you have shown also in your presentation is that it's very good to have the analysis that you've done repeatable, right? Both on the data preparation level, but also on the analysis level. So you can easily, if you get fresh data you want to verify the next year, you can repeat very easily what you've done before. On the other hand, if you're doing the process-mining analysis for the very first time, it sounds like maybe even a little bit more time needs to be planned for due to these kind of additional data preparation challenges that you can expect and should plan for. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all three for joining this discussion on process mining in audit. So thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Mieke.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Yes, and so let's continue the discussion in the camp community on Slack. You can further put any comments you have there, and we are all there to further discuss and continue what we've talked about here today. Tomorrow we will be back with the third day of process mining camp, and we will go into manufacturing processes. So quite a different world, but also very interesting world for process mining. And also as a last reminder for those of you participating in the process mining lab, you can find everything there for the second challenge in the Slack community as well. So thanks again for tuning in today. Thank you for joining the discussion, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye bye everyone.